Dawn, November 2nd, 1943. A New Zealand officer stepped cautiously out of a battered blockhouse on a narrow jungle beach in the Solomon Islands and began counting the dead. At first, the number seemed impossible. Bodies lay tangled in coils of barbed wire, scattered across churned sand, and half hidden beneath broken palms and shattered undergrowth. Some had fallen only a few yards from the defensive perimeter. Others had reached the wire before collapsing where rifle and machine gun fire had stopped them. He counted past 10, then 20, then 40. When he finally finished, more than 50 Japanese soldiers surrounded a position that, only hours earlier, had been defended by just 9 men. 6 New Zealanders, 3 Americans. It looked like the aftermath of a hopeless last stand. Yet the deeper historians have examined that night, the stranger the story has become. Popular accounts of the Pacific War often follow a familiar pattern. Japanese troops underestimate an Allied force, launch a reckless assault, and pay a terrible price. That certainly happened elsewhere during the war. But the evidence from this beach tells a different story. The men who attacked this position weren't charging forward because they believed victory would come easily. By late 1943, they understood exactly how dangerous Allied firepower had become. Many had endured months of isolation, dwindling rations, disease, and relentless pressure across the Solomon Islands. Their assault was not born from confidence, it was born from desperation. So why would experienced soldiers, already weakened by months of hardship, launch an attack against a carefully prepared, defensive position protected by machine guns, barbed wire, and overlapping fields of fire? The answer begins hundreds of miles away from this shattered blockhouse, with an operation so small that it rarely appears in most histories of the Pacific War. Yet without it, one of the Allies' next major offensives would have become far more dangerous. The operation carried an almost cheerful codename, Operation Goodtime. There was very little cheerful about it. To understand why this forgotten beach became the scene of one of New Zealand's hardest-fought actions of the Second World War, it's worth stepping back for a moment, not to the beginning of the Pacific War, but to the beginning of New Zealand's own journey back into amphibious combat. For nearly 3 decades, New Zealand soldiers had not attempted an opposed landing. The last time they had fought their way ashore under enemy resistance was at Gallipoli in 1915. That campaign left an imprint on the country's military identity unlike almost any other event in its history. Gallipoli became a symbol of sacrifice, endurance, and costly lessons learned through failure. Every generation of officers who followed understood what an opposed landing could demand from ordinary soldiers. When plans emerged for the Treasury Islands operation in late 1943, many veterans recognized its historical significance immediately. This would be New Zealand's first opposed amphibious assault in 28 years. The men preparing for it, however, were not the veterans who had fought Rommel across North Africa or battled through Italy. Those experienced formations belonged to the 2nd New Zealand Expeditionary Force, serving thousands of miles away in an entirely different theater of war. The Pacific Campaign belonged to another formation altogether, the 3rd New Zealand Division. It was a younger division, created after Japan's dramatic victories in 1942 transformed the strategic situation across the Pacific. The fall of Singapore, the conquest of Malaya, and the rapid advance through Southeast Asia forced governments across the region to reconsider assumptions that had existed for decades. For New Zealand, the war no longer felt like a distant conflict being fought somewhere beyond the horizon. Japanese expansion had brought the front line dramatically closer to home. The newly raised 3rd Division spent months training in Fiji and New Caledonia, learning skills few of its soldiers had imagined they would need. Amphibious landings, jungle navigation, small unit patrols through dense tropical terrain, coordinating with American naval forces, fighting in an environment completely unlike the deserts where many Allied tactical doctrines had been developed. It was, in many respects, a division learning an entirely new way of war. Its commander, Major General Harold Barrowclaw, understood that success in the Pacific would depend less on spectacular battlefield maneuvers than on careful planning, disciplined infantry, and cooperation between Allied forces operating thousands of miles from their own supply bases. Every landing required ships, engineers, artillery, communication specialists, and naval coordination. Even a relatively small operation demanded remarkable logistical precision. Operation Goodtime would test all of it. At first glance, the Treasury Islands hardly looked important enough to justify such effort. The island group sat just south of Bougainville, covered in thick jungle and surrounded by reefs that made navigation difficult. Before the war, few people outside the region had ever heard their names. Even within Allied planning staffs, the treasuries were never intended to become one of the Pacific War's great battles. Their importance came from geography. The Allies were preparing for the invasion of Bougainville, one of the next major steps in the campaign to isolate the powerful Japanese fortress at Rabaul. To support that operation, they needed an advanced radar station capable of detecting incoming Japanese aircraft as early as possible. They also needed sheltered anchorages for patrol torpedo boats that would operate against Japanese shipping throughout the surrounding waters. The Treasury Islands offered both. Capture them, and Allied aircraft and naval forces would receive valuable early warning during the Bougainville campaign. Lose them, and the next phase of the Solomon Islands offensive would become considerably more difficult. For Japanese commanders, however, the treasuries had become increasingly difficult to defend. The garrison stationed there numbered only around 225 men, many belonging to the 7th Combined Special Naval Landing Force. Despite the impressive title, they were not an elite assault force waiting behind elaborate fortifications. Many had originally served construction and support roles, tasked with building and maintaining facilities on what had once been considered a relatively quiet outpost. By late 1943, nothing about the island remained quiet. Months of Allied advances through the Solomon Islands had steadily isolated Japanese positions across the region. American naval victories had disrupted supply routes. Allied aircraft increasingly dominated the skies. Food, medicine, and ammunition reached isolated garrisons only sporadically, if they arrived at all. Captured diaries from the campaign reveal men who understood their situation with painful clarity. Rather than writing about victory, many wrote about hunger, sickness, and uncertainty. They watched Allied aircraft appear overhead with increasing frequency. They understood that reinforcements were becoming less likely with every passing week. What they did not know was exactly when the Allies would arrive. That answer came shortly before dawn on October 27, 1943. At 5:45 that morning, American destroyers opened fire on suspected Japanese positions across Mono Island. 21 minutes later, New Zealand landing craft began moving toward the beaches. For the soldiers climbing down cargo nets into those small boats, history suddenly stopped being something that had happened at Gallipoli a generation earlier. It was about to happen again. And while the main assault force pushed toward Falamai, another, much smaller detachment quietly separated from the rest of the invasion. Its destination was a little-known stretch of coastline called Soanotalu. Its commander was Major Edward Logan. Neither he nor the men following him could have known that within a few days they would become the final obstacle between an isolated Japanese garrison and its last chance of escape. The main landings achieved their immediate objectives with surprising speed. New Zealand troops secured Falamai, while nearby Sterling Island offered little organized resistance at all. For a few hours, it appeared that Operation Goodtime might unfold exactly as Allied planners had hoped. A swift amphibious assault followed by the systematic elimination of an isolated Japanese garrison. Then the first reminder arrived that the battle was far from over. Later that afternoon, formations of Japanese dive bombers crossed the skies over the Treasury Islands from bases at Rabaul and Bougainville. Their target wasn't the infantry ashore, but the ships lying at anchor offshore. Allied fighters intercepted the raid and destroyed nearly half of the attacking aircraft. Yet several bombers broke through the defensive screen. One scored a direct hit on the destroyer USS Coney, killing 8 American sailors and wounding many more. The message was unmistakable. The Allies might control the beaches, but Japanese forces still possessed the ability to strike back. More importantly, the operation had announced itself to every surviving Japanese soldier on the island. While explosions echoed across the southern beaches, Major Edward Logan's detachment was carrying out a mission that received little attention in official reports at the time, but would later prove critical. Unlike the main assault force, Logan's men weren't tasked with capturing villages or clearing large sections of jungle. Their destination was a quiet stretch of coastline at Soanotalu, several miles away from the main landing area. On paper, their assignment sounded almost routine. Secure the beach, protect the engineers, get the radar operational, then hold the position. It was the kind of mission that rarely makes history books. Yet wars are often decided as much by the protection of vital infrastructure as by dramatic battlefield victories. Every soldier in Logan Force was there because of one piece of equipment that most of them would never operate themselves: the radar station. Without it, Allied commanders preparing for Bougainville would lose one of their earliest warning systems against Japanese aircraft approaching from Rabaul. A delay of even a few minutes in detecting incoming bombers could mean the difference between launching interceptors in time or watching ships burn at anchor. That made the radar installation one of the most valuable pieces of equipment on the entire island. The men responsible for protecting it formed an unusual collection of personnel. At the heart of the force stood riflemen from New Zealand's 34th Battalion, commanded by Major Logan. Supporting them were American Coast Artillery personnel, Navy Seabees responsible for construction work, engineers, communication specialists, and radar technicians. Under ordinary circumstances, these men performed entirely different jobs. Now they would depend upon one another for survival. The landing itself met almost no resistance. At first glance, that seemed like remarkably good fortune. In reality, it was the first sign that something far more dangerous was already unfolding elsewhere on the island. The Japanese defenders had not disappeared. They had moved. As the larger Allied force advanced inland from Falamai, Japanese positions began collapsing one after another. Patrols pushed methodically through dense tropical jungle, clearing defensive pockets and forcing the surviving garrison steadily northward. Each day, the available ground became smaller. Each patrol narrowed another avenue of retreat. Unlike the dramatic battles often portrayed in films, the fighting across Mono Island was less a series of spectacular engagements than a slow tightening of a net. The jungle itself became an active participant in that process. Towering trees blocked sunlight even during the middle of the day. Thick undergrowth reduced visibility to only a few yards in many places. Heavy rain transformed narrow footpaths into streams of mud, capable of exhausting even experienced soldiers before they ever reached the enemy. Moving artillery through such terrain was nearly impossible. Supplies often had to be carried by hand. Every patrol became physically demanding long before the first shot was fired, yet those same conditions also limited Japanese movement. Every route north eventually led toward one unavoidable destination: Soanotalu. Neither side understood that immediately. For Logan's men, the beach remained simply another defensive assignment. Patrol reports suggested Japanese troops were still scattered throughout the interior. An attack seemed possible, but no one could predict where it might develop or how large it would become. For the Japanese garrison, however, the situation was changing with alarming speed. Captured diaries written during those final days reveal soldiers who recognized that their position had become increasingly hopeless. Food had become scarce long before the invasion. Ammunition was carefully conserved. Disease weakened men already suffering from inadequate rations. Allied naval superiority made meaningful resupply almost impossible, while constant air attacks reminded them that friendly aircraft no longer controlled the skies. Perhaps the most striking aspect of those diaries is what they do not contain. They do not speak with confidence about throwing the invaders back into the sea. They do not predict victory, nor do they dismiss the New Zealanders as inexperienced opponents. Instead, they describe uncertainty, fatigue, hunger, and an awareness that time was running out. That evidence matters because it challenges one of the most persistent assumptions about this battle. When viewers hear that 9 defenders later held off a force many times their size, the natural conclusion is that the attackers must have underestimated them. The historical record suggests something very different. By late 1943, Japanese soldiers throughout the Solomon Islands had already experienced months of costly fighting against increasingly powerful Allied forces. Earlier campaigns, particularly Guadalcanal, had demonstrated the consequences of underestimating Allied strength. Survivors carried those lessons with them. The men now moving north through Mono Island weren't repeating the mistakes of 1942. They were confronting the consequences of them. Every mile they retreated reduced their options. To the south came New Zealand patrols advancing steadily through the jungle. To the east and west lay coastlines controlled by Allied naval forces. Behind them stretched miles of rainforest, offering fewer supplies with every passing day. Ahead stood Logan Force. Unintentionally, Major Logan had established his position directly across the last realistic route leading toward the small landing craft anchored at Soanotalu. Those boats had arrived simply to support Allied operations. Yet, from the Japanese perspective, they represented something entirely different: escape. If the boats could be captured, at least part of the garrison might break free of an island that had become an enormous trap. If they could not, there would be nowhere left to go. Major Logan knew none of this. He simply continued strengthening his perimeter. The terrain offered little room for elaborate maneuver. Dense jungle pressed almost against the shoreline, leaving only narrow approaches toward the defensive position. Rather than spreading his men thinly across a broad front, Logan concentrated his defenses around mutually supporting positions connected by carefully planned fields of fire. Barbed wire protected the most likely avenues of approach. Machine guns covered open ground. Rifle pits reinforced one another so that no single position would have to fight alone. At the heart of it all stood a reinforced blockhouse. It wasn't impressive, it wasn't large, but Logan understood that if the perimeter ever came under serious pressure, that small structure would become the anchor holding everything together. Behind it, American engineers continued working on the radar installation. Construction equipment still lay scattered across the beach. Some technicians remained focused on assembling machinery that would soon watch the skies over Bougainville. It was a strange mixture of routine military work and growing uncertainty. No one knew exactly when the Japanese would strike, only that every passing day made an attack more likely. As the sun disappeared below the jungle canopy on November 1st, silence gradually settled across Soanotalu. Inside the perimeter, weapons were checked one final time. Ammunition was counted. Sentries listened into the darkness. Beyond the trees, unseen by the men guarding the radar station, dozens of exhausted Japanese soldiers were gathering for what many of them understood might be the final operation of their lives. As darkness settled over Soanotalu on the night of November 1st, the waiting finally ended. Sometime after nightfall, movement began beyond the tree line. No one could see very far. The dense jungle and the absence of moonlight reduced visibility to only a few yards. The defenders listened more than they looked, trying to separate ordinary jungle sounds from the careful movement of men approaching through the undergrowth. Then the silence broke. Rifle fire erupted across the perimeter. Almost immediately, machine guns answered from Logan's prepared positions. Tracer rounds briefly illuminated the wire before darkness swallowed everything once again. For the men inside the blockhouse, the battle became one of sound rather than sight. Muzzle flashes revealed fleeting targets. Voices echoed through the jungle without revealing exactly where they came from. Every burst of fire seemed to come from a different direction. The Japanese pressed repeatedly against the perimeter, searching for any weakness that might carry them through to the beach beyond. Again and again they reached the defensive wire, only to be met by overlapping fields of rifle and machine gun fire that Logan had carefully planned days earlier. The defenders had only one task: keep the line intact. The attackers had only one chance: break through before daylight made any further assault impossible. Hour after hour, neither side gave ground. Then, just before dawn, the firing began to fade. As first light spread across the beach, the defenders cautiously stepped beyond their positions to understand what had happened during the night. The sight before them explained everything. Bodies lay scattered across the approaches to the blockhouse, caught in the barbed wire and spread across the churned sand where the attacks had stalled. More than 50 Japanese soldiers had fallen around a position defended by only 9 men. The breakthrough had failed. The landing craft remained in Allied hands. The radar station survived. Within days it would begin providing early warning for the invasion of Bougainville, exactly as Allied planners had intended. Yet the battle's greatest legacy wasn't measured only by casualties or strategic success. It survived because men on both sides left behind something far more personal than official reports. Diaries. New Zealand soldiers recorded the exhaustion of jungle warfare, the endless rain, the uncertainty of patrols, and the violence of that single night. Captured Japanese diaries revealed an equally human perspective. They spoke not of arrogance or easy victory, but of hunger, dwindling supplies, isolation, and the growing realization that defeat was becoming unavoidable. Read together. These accounts transform the battle from a simple story of winners and losers into something far more revealing. Two groups of ordinary soldiers, trapped by decisions made far above them, enduring the same jungle, the same fear, and the same uncertainty from opposite sides of the wire. That is why the story of Soanotalu deserves to be remembered. It isn't remarkable because 9 men defeated an enemy that underestimated them. The historical evidence simply doesn't support that conclusion. By late 1943, the Japanese soldiers on Mono Island understood all too well what Allied firepower could do. Their final assault was not an act of misplaced confidence, but a desperate attempt to escape an island that had become a prison. And perhaps that makes the defenders' achievement even more extraordinary. They did not repel a careless enemy. They held their ground against men who believed they had nothing left to lose. Today, the Treasury Islands rarely appear in popular histories of the Pacific War. Larger battles overshadow them. Bigger names dominate documentaries and textbooks. Yet, hidden within this forgotten campaign is a story that reminds us history is not shaped only by famous generals or massive armies. Sometimes it turns on a handful of exhausted soldiers defending a small blockhouse on a beach few people have ever heard of. When that New Zealand officer counted the bodies at dawn, he wasn't simply recording the aftermath of a battle. He was witnessing the end of one of the last desperate attempts by an isolated garrison to change its fate. And the moment a handful of determined defenders quietly secured a victory that helped make the next Allied advance possible. More than 80 years later, because both sides left behind their words as well as their weapons, we can still understand not only what happened at Soanotalu, but why.